The White House press briefing room buzzed with an anxious, anticipatory energy, the kind that always signals a political reckoning. The name on everyone's tongue that morning was Tulsi Gabard, the newly appointed Director of National Intelligence, a role that, only months ago, no one would have predicted she'd hold. But now, here she was. Stone-faced. Calm. Ready. She stepped up to the podium with the posture of someone who had just walked through fire. Her presence was commanding, but not theatrical. No slogans. No posturing. Just the unnerving poise of someone who wasn't afraid to say something unpopular. The White House press secretary had barely finished introducing her when the first question sliced through the air like a blade. "Director Gabard," said Michael Rand, senior political correspondent for The Guardian, "you've said recently that some federal departments have drifted into ideological territory that no longer serves the American people. Care to clarify which departments you're referring to? Because sources suggest you're eyeing the Department of Education." Tulsi didn't blink. "That's correct." A few reporters exchanged glances. A couple of heads turned. Cameras zoomed in. "You're confirming it?" Rand pressed, almost incredulous. "I am," she said evenly. "I believe the Department of Education, in its current form, is failing to serve its intended purpose. We have to be willing to question institutions, even the ones we've grown accustomed to protecting." "Are you calling for its elimination?" Another reporter jumped in. "That sounds extreme, even by your standards." "I'm calling for a serious national conversation," she replied. "Not slogans. Not symbolic outrage. We've reached a point where education policy is being shaped more by ideology than by measurable outcomes. That should concern everyone, left, right, and center." Hands shot up across the room. "But you're the Director of National Intelligence," came a voice from NBC. "Not Secretary of Education. Why weigh in at all?" Tulsi leaned forward slightly. "Because what happens in our schools affects what kind of nation we become. And from an intelligence standpoint, we are seeing patterns of civic disengagement, declining trust in institutions, and generational fragmentation. The data is there. You can either dismiss it or confront it." A quiet tension crept across the room. Someone coughed. A pen clicked nervously. Rand wasn't done. "So just to be clear, you're saying the Department of Education is a national security risk?" Her eyes locked on his. "I'm saying that the erosion of civic understanding, the politicization of curriculum, and the disconnection between education and reality contribute to national insecurity. If you think that's melodramatic, then I suggest you review the literacy rates, the civic knowledge tests, and the increasing number of young Americans who say they wouldn't defend the Constitution." Another reporter chimed in, this one from CNN. "Isn't this just a partisan argument disguised as policy critique? We've heard this language before, from libertarians, from populists. Are you borrowing talking points?" Tulsi didn't hesitate. "If the truth overlaps with rhetoric you dislike, that doesn't make it less true. The numbers speak for themselves. Our K-12 system spends more money per student than most developed nations and yet delivers weaker outcomes in math, reading, and basic civics. That's not a partisan failure. That's a national one." Someone from the New York Times cut in sharply. "Do you have data showing that shutting down the Federal Department of Education would improve outcomes? Isn't this just a symbolic move to appease political allies?" "No," Tulsi said. "It's not symbolic. It's structural. The department has overreached. Decisions about what students learn are better made closer to home, by communities and educators who understand the cultural and economic realities of their students. Not by bureaucrats in D.C. who are insulated from accountability." "But don't local districts already control the curriculum?" a voice challenged from the back. "On paper, yes. In reality, not quite," she replied. "Federal grant incentives, national testing regimes, and politically driven accreditation models have quietly shaped what gets taught and how. Local control is often nominal. That needs to change." A longer pause followed this time. Then Rand's voice returned, more pointed now. "You're calling for decentralization. But what happens when a school in a poor district can't afford quality teachers or textbooks? When federal support disappears, don't we just deepen inequality?" Tulsi inhaled slowly. "That's a real concern. And I'm not denying that the federal government has a role to play in addressing inequality. But we need to separate financial support from policy control. One doesn't require the other. You can fund without dictating. And who replaces the department's oversight? Someone else asked. You want 50 states running 50 different systems? No, she said. I want a system that respects diversity without sacrificing quality. That encourages innovation instead of enforcing conformity. That stops using children as ideological proxies in adult battles. A beat of silence. Then a voice from the Washington Post. So to be clear, Director, you're not just proposing reform. You're proposing dismantling an entire federal department. I'm proposing we ask the uncomfortable question, what exactly is it doing? And is it doing it well enough to justify its existence? Another silence fell. Not hostile. Not confused. Just quiet. As if, for a moment, no one knew how to follow that up. By the following morning, Tulsi Gabbard's comments were the lead story on every major news outlet. The press briefing had gone viral, split-screened, clipped, dissected on podcasts and talk shows across the spectrum. On Twitter, #AbolishDOE and #GabbardUnfit were trending simultaneously. Back in the press room, she returned to the podium, unshaken. This time, the energy was different. Sharper. More adversarial. First up was Patricia Lee from NPR, calm but loaded. Director Gabbard, yesterday you claimed the Department of Education contributes to national insecurity. You're now facing bipartisan criticism, including from former CIA directors who say your comments were reckless and politically motivated. Care to respond? Tulsi adjusted the mic. I'm not here to be popular. I'm here to be honest. If former officials believe it's reckless to question institutional inertia, that says more about their comfort with dysfunction than it does about my motives. And what dysfunction, exactly? Patricia pressed. Are you suggesting the Department of Education is actively harming national unity? Tulsi nodded slightly. Yes. In some cases, not by intent, but by consequence. We've normalized curricula that confuse activism with education, politics with pedagogy. Students are emerging less prepared to think critically, and more inclined to view their country as a flawed abstraction rather than a shared project. Darius Kendall from Reuters jumped in. That sounds a lot like a cultural argument dressed up as policy. What specific reforms are you proposing, beyond the rhetoric? I'm proposing we move toward a distributed model, Tulsi said, where states take back full control over curriculum, standards, and assessments, with federal involvement limited strictly to funding, infrastructure, and civil rights enforcement. Kendall frowned. So no federal say over what gets taught in history or science. Correct, she replied. We already have 50 different economies, 50 different public health systems, 50 different legal frameworks. Why are we clinging to the idea that education must be uniform to be effective? A flurry of hands shot up. She pointed to Karen Wilcox, Politico. Director Gabbard, several education policy experts have warned that your proposal would create chaos, uneven standards, confusion for families who move between states, and potential violations of civil rights laws. Are you confident this isn't just decentralization for its own sake? I'm confident we've confused centralization with quality, Tulsi said. We've built a system where accountability is upward, toward bureaucrats and lobbyists, not outward, toward parents, teachers, and students. That's the real chaos. The press room murmured. Michael Rand, who had been quiet until now, raised his hand again. You've said this isn't political. But the language you're using, ideological programming, indoctrination, bureaucratic overreach, sounds a lot like right-wing talking points. Are you aligning yourself with the populist movement? Tulsi didn't flinch. If the truth overlaps with talking points from any political movement, I'm not going to avoid it out of fear of guilt by association. I've criticized both parties when they've protected bad policy. This isn't about politics. It's about priorities. Rand pushed. But you're using the language of culture wars. You've said students are being taught to distrust their country. Can you point to specific examples? She nodded. Yes. In multiple states, we've seen social studies curricula that frame American history almost exclusively through the lens of oppression and exploitation, with little or no emphasis on constitutional development, civic responsibility, or institutional progress. That imbalance doesn't foster critical thinking. It fosters cynicism. But isn't that just history as it happened? A voice asked from the second row. Shouldn't we be teaching the uncomfortable parts? Absolutely, Tulsi said. But honesty and pessimism aren't the same thing. Teaching history should be about equipping students to engage with complexity, not to internalize defeatism. Patricia spoke up again. So what's the end goal here? You said yesterday that you're not calling for a symbolic gesture. Are you actually advocating for a congressional vote to eliminate the Department of Education? I'm advocating for Congress to ask whether the department has fulfilled its mission, and if not, whether its core responsibilities can be fulfilled better at the state level, Tulsi said. If we started from scratch today, would we build this system again? That's the question no one wants to ask. The room paused again. Not because they agreed, but because the question lingered. Tulsi scanned the crowd, voice steady now. When a system becomes more committed to preserving itself than to serving its purpose, it's time to challenge it. That's not radical. That's accountability. A few reporters glanced at each other. One scribbled the quote word for word. Then Darius asked, "Do you anticipate resignations from within your own agency over this stance?" She shrugged. Possibly. But if people are more loyal to departments than to the country, they're in the wrong job. A hush. Tulsi stepped back from the podium. That's all for today. And just like that, she walked off stage, leaving the press corps scrambling for reaction quotes, while somewhere in Congress, phones began to ring. By day 3, the story had gone beyond the Beltway. Across the country, headlines filled homepages. Gabard versus the Department of Education. Federal power or local control. A national security director's war on schools. Even in small-town papers, op-eds flourished. Some praised her courage. Others called her dangerous. On cable news, she was either a reformer or a fire-starter, depending on the cheerin'. Back in Washington, the briefing room was at capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in. The temperature, both literal and rhetorical, had risen. Tulsi Gabard entered without notes. Before the first question, she offered a brief opening. I've been called reckless, uninformed, extreme. That's fine. We can talk about me all day. But while we do that, American students are slipping further behind. Let's stay focused. The room barely paused before the barrage began. A veteran reporter from PBS raised her voice. Director Gabard, the National Association of State Boards of Education issued a statement this morning calling your proposal a direct threat to the stability of public learning. How do you respond? Tulsi's answer came quickly. I think what's truly unstable is our current system, top-heavy, inefficient, and often hostile to innovation. The fact that so many are panicking at the idea of local control suggests they don't trust the very communities they claim to serve. Some would say that's exactly the issue, said a younger journalist from The Atlantic. That local control has historically led to inequality, racial segregation, and wildly different educational quality. Isn't this just history repeating itself? Inequality exists now, Tulsi replied. We just hide it better under a federal umbrella. The illusion of fairness is not fairness. If anything, the one-size-fits-all model makes it harder for struggling districts to adapt. Michael Rand stood again. His tone was sharper than it had been 2 days earlier. Director, at what point does this go beyond decentralization? You're sowing distrust in a federal institution. Can't that, in itself, be destabilizing? Questioning an institution is not the same as tearing it down, Tulsi said. That kind of thinking is how institutions become untouchable, even when they stop working. This isn't sabotage. It's sunlight. A reporter from Education Weekly jumped in. You've used phrases like ideological capture and national insecurity. Some teachers' unions are accusing you of smearing educators to score political points. Can you name one policy, one curriculum that directly supports your claim? Tulsi didn't hesitate. Sure. In several states, districts influenced by federal grant programs have adopted language guidelines that discourage the use of terms like founding fathers or American exceptionalism. Instead of contextualizing our flaws, they erase our framework. That's not education. That's narrative control. A few murmurs rippled through the room. But isn't this just cultural drift? Another reporter asked. Societies evolve. Education reflects that. Societies can evolve without abandoning shared meaning, she replied. But when children are taught to believe their nation is built solely on oppression, and that any pride is inherently suspect, we're not evolving, we're unraveling. Patricia from NPR raised her hand again. You're calling this an intelligence issue. But are you suggesting there's a coordinated agenda? From who? I'm not suggesting conspiracy, Tulsi said plainly. I'm saying incentives matter. The federal structure now rewards conformity over competence, activism over academics. That trend has grown unchecked. And yes, it affects our national health, just like poor infrastructure or fractured communication systems. Teachers are calling for your resignation, Michael Rand said. Some say this is demoralizing the profession. I've met too many teachers who feel the same frustration, she said. But they're drowned out by bureaucrats and advocacy groups. I'm not here to demonize teachers. I'm here to ask why their jobs are harder than they need to be. A pause. Then came a voice from Bloomberg. Let's say Congress considers your position. What happens to federal education funding? Title I, Pell Grants, school lunches, what becomes of those programs? Tulsi answered carefully. No one is proposing ending support. We're talking about separating funding from policy authority. You can fund without dictating standards. It happens in other sectors. It can happen here. But what does that look like in practice? Asked the New York Times correspondent. What happens when one state teaches climate change as settled science and another teaches it as controversial theory? She nodded. It looks like pluralism. It's messy, but it's also real democracy. If we can tolerate 50 models of taxation, we can tolerate 50 models of learning, if we maintain transparency and respect for basic civil rights. Rand stepped in once more, voice lower now. So let's say this goes forward. The Department of Education is dissolved. What happens the day after? Who's accountable? Tulsi paused. State boards. Local communities. And yes, parents. Accountability starts closer to the student, not farther. But doesn't that invite chaos? He pressed. It invites responsibility, she said. Which is more than I can say for what we have now. There were no final remarks. No grand statement. Tulsi stepped down quietly, walked past the cameras, and out into a hallway where, behind closed doors, members of Congress were already huddling, some drafting bills in defense of the Department of Education, others, something different. A week later, the country was still talking. Tulsi Gabbard's name was on late-night monologues, morning talk shows, editorial pages, and dinner tables. School boards were issuing statements. Teachers' unions held emergency webinars. State legislators were giving press conferences in parking lots and gymnasiums. And Congress, they were circling. Inside the Capitol, rumors swirled of a bipartisan resolution to reaffirm the essential role of the Department of Education in preserving national unity. A response, thinly veiled, to Tulsi's campaign. But Tulsi wasn't retreating. Instead, she requested one more press briefing. A surprise. No aides. No polished PowerPoint. Just her. The press room was quieter than usual. Not because the interest had faded. Far from it. But because by now, people realized she wasn't saying these things for shock value. She meant them. Every word. She opened bluntly. I've been accused of threatening stability, undermining trust, encouraging chaos. But ask yourself, what if the chaos was already here, and I just named it? Cameras clicked. Reporters leaned forward. You've heard the outrage. Let's hear the argument, she continued. The Department of Education was created in 1979 to improve coordination and ensure equitable standards. 45 years later, test scores are stagnant. Trust in public education is falling. Parents are pulling their kids out in record numbers. Meanwhile, costs continue to rise. A hand rose. Michael Rand, The Guardian. You're painting a dire picture. But is it that bad? Public education still serves over 90% of American students. Doesn't that mean it's working? No, Tulsi said calmly. It means we don't have better options. And when the most common option is also the most inflexible, we call that compliance, not success. Karen Wilcox from Politico jumped in. Director, critics say your campaign isn't about performance, it's about control. That decentralization is just another way of washing the federal government's hands of responsibility. Tulsi leaned into the podium. What's more responsible, letting local communities shape education in a way that reflects their needs, or imposing distant mandates that fail to adapt to reality on the ground? But local control risks inequality, Wilcox argued. We already have inequality, Tulsi said. The difference is, right now, no one's allowed to fix it without permission from a distant bureaucracy. Another voice. So what's your vision? Not the critique. The plan. Her response was clear. Phase out the department's policy functions. Keep funding mechanisms, temporarily. Transition oversight to independent interstate compacts, tailored regionally. Create a federal transparency office, not a policy office. Let states innovate. Let parents see everything. Let teachers teach without fearing they'll violate a shifting code of ideological conduct. Will you submit a formal proposal? Someone asked. Yes. And I'll brief every relevant committee myself. Rand stood again. Director Gabard, one final question. Are you doing this because you truly believe the Department of Education is broken, or because it's politically convenient for you? Tulsi stared directly at him. I spent years in uniform. I've seen what happens when people lose faith in their institutions. I'm doing this because we've reached that point with public education. And instead of patching holes in a sinking ship, I'm asking whether we need a better vessel. The room went quiet. Not from agreement, but from weight. From the sense that a real line had been drawn, and no one would be able to walk it back. Later that evening, as the sun set over the Potomac, a group of House members from both parties emerged from a closed-door meeting. Some were furious. Others were deeply uneasy. But one thing was clear: legislation was coming.